Father Hugo Mcbride is a long-serving member of the St. Patrick's Missionaries. He was ordained in 1966 and worked in Nigeria for many years, as well as South Africa. He speaks to us about his upbringing in Ireland and his missionary work. We begin with his early childhood and early schooling.
Well, I grew up in Ballycastle and in the very northeast corner of Ireland. You could see Scotland, the Mull of Kintyre from our house. I was blessed to be born in what I would consider one of the most beautiful spots in the whole of Ireland, and to me, one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been to. And that's the first thing that strikes me. I grew up in a happy family. There was a bit of tension with my mother's in-laws because it was during the Second World War. I was born in 1941, just a while before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So it was right in the... We had been living in Belfast, apparently, the family, but moved to Ballycastle. And because of the danger of bombing, etc., I was born in Dublin, where my mother's people had gone to. But my conscious memories, I returned to Ballycastle when I was, I think, 3 weeks old, and I stayed there for the first 7 years of my life, and I loved it. So we were staying with my grandparents and 2 maiden aunts. We were a very happy and a lovely, happy childhood, surrounded by soldiers. Down at the seafront, at the harbour and the beach, you had the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, right behind our house, in a huge big field behind our house. You had a section of the Free Belgian Army camping. And up at the top of the town, you had the Americans. So I grew up surrounded by Bren gun carriers and armoured cars and soldiers marching and lorries and jeeps and all that kind of stuff. So it was really exciting for me. And my mother was a very gentle lover of nature. When we were very young, she took us out for long walks along the beach or up Glen Shesk. And she'd be making us smell the honeysuckle and smell the wild roses and pointing out the butterflies and pointing out things of beauty, and I suppose trying to stop us from jumping into the pools of tar on the road, which were beginning to melt with the heat of the sun. And I suppose that's always stayed with me, even on the occasional trip to Dublin to stay with my uncles. Remember, my earliest memories of Dublin is being lifted up by my uncle to smell the standard roses in the back garden. And that love of flowers, that love of beauty has stayed with me all my life. My dad wasn't there a lot of the time because he was an inspector in the bank. And the bank stretched all over Ireland, so he would be going round the various branches. He wasn't an inspector, he was what was called a relief manager. So I remember him as a big man in a suit. And we all had to be very well behaved when he would come home, because he couldn't get home very often because there was great restrictions due to petrol shortages. And it took forever to get from the southwest of Ireland down to the northeast, or up to the northeast of Antrim. So it was only once every month or two that he would pay a visit. I remember I was brought up, the Cross and Passion sisters taught the baby infants and senior infants, as it was called, in Ballycastle, the first 2 classes when you went to primary school. And I can remember vividly going there the first day, and my pal, Barney Downey from up the road, he was walking along whistling with his hands in his pockets, full of confidence, and I was crying and digging in my heels and had to be dragged. I hated school, and I never really got to liking school at any time. I don't know why. The sisters were lovely as I got to know them in later years, but as a little fella looking up at these big nuns, even though they were quite tiny people, as I discovered when I grew up, but they were big for us. They were big authority figures in their black robes, and they weren't above giving you a little cuff in the cheek or confiscating your toys or things that you might be playing with when you should be trying to learn your ABC. But basically it was no problem. No problem at all. A very, very clear memory of going up to the chapel one day with my mother, and all around the whole outside of the church were the rifles. I think it must have been before D-Day, and the troops were beginning to leave Ballycastle to head off for, I suppose, for death, most of them. And they were up saying Mass. They were up for Mass. The Belgians, of course, were Catholic. There'd be some Americans there. The British were, by and large, not Catholic. But those are memories that I had. Really happy. Seemed to be a lot of sunshine. The house, once we got to at the age of 4, you only came to the house to eat and to sleep. The rest of the time you were out. We were down at the fields, down playing at the river, down at the beach. We were given wonderful freedom. There wasn't all the strange kind of people around nowadays, where people have to be very careful of their children. We were let out like the goats out of the kraal in the morning. Ramble all around. You could eat in any house. All our friends, you ate where you got food. You just went from one house to the other with your playing, and when it was dinner time, didn't matter whose house you were. You got your dinner, and they got their dinner when they were in our house. But it was a very happy memories. There were 4 of us, 2 boys and 2 girls at that time, and then my twin brothers were born just before we left Ballycastle. So that brought us to 6, and eventually in Belfast, my 2 youngest sisters, Mary and Rosemary, were born. So that brought us to 8, 4 boys and 4 girls. Really nice community. Didn't stay in Belfast a lot because I was sent to boarding school at Garn Tower. Again, one of the real beauty spots along the Antrim coast. And there I met up with quite a few of our KILTEGAN fellas. Noel McHenry, Terry Nash, PJ McCampbell, Liam Blaney, and lots more that I can't just remember at the moment. We were all together at boarding school at that time. So we were friends, and that continued, of course, when we went to KILTEGAN. We were flogged, Joe, at school. We were flogged, but outside of the class halls, we had fun. We had really, really good fun. We had a mountain behind us and the sea in front of us, and no boundaries, hardly at all. We used to supplement boarding school diet at the weekend by it was when the first time that this packaged soup came out, and there was a thing called chicken noodle soup. We used to bring it back and build little huts up the mountain in the forest and boil up our soup and steal a few potatoes from the field, from the farmer's field, and have a nice little meal up there. Sure, it was wonderful. And we used to swim in a pool underneath a waterfall. Yeah, those were lovely memories of Garn Tower.
So how did Father Hugo get to know of the St. Patrick's missionaries?
Well, it was easy enough because in my parish in Belfast, the McSorley family lived, and Father Liam McSorley was a member of KILTEGAN. He was a vocations director, and his mother and my mother were good friends, and they were a very prominent family. They were kind of the main doctors for in the parish area at the time. And his brother, Freddie, was also a priest, and he was teaching in Garntower. And sure, the missionaries came round to talk to us in the schools. And the Columbans came round talking about how their men had been martyred and executed in China. And I had made one resolution early on in life. I went to see a movie called Camp and Blood Island, which showed it was a prisoner of war camp during the Second World War, and there were dreadful scenes of Japanese soldiers torturing British soldiers. And I came out of that cinema, I said, I'm going to give those boys a wide berth in life. I'm not going to go near those Oriental people. So there was no chance of me going to the Columbans. So the other option was to go to KILTEGAN. And the fact that Noel McHenry had gone the year before and they hadn't thrown him out meant that, Jesus, if they didn't throw McHenry out, there was a chance for us all. So I went there. And you know, KILTEGAN is a very beautiful place in September, in early September when we went there. And we had various walks. But the place is so beautiful that it lifts your heart. And there was nowhere comfortable to stay indoors. So you were out walking during the 30-day retreat a lot, out walking around the grounds. And sure, it was heaven itself. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. Then we went down to Cork, and the sheep were divided from the goats, in the sense that some guys got to go to university and other guys had to stay in the house and learn some kind of basic philosophy. And I was among those. And it was a bit hard because you'd have liked to go to university. And I had good enough grades, but that's the way it is. Well, we were lucky. We had great teachers. We had Vin McNamara and Tom Kern, that I thought were the best teachers I ever had. Wonderful people. So, like theology, and when we were in KILTEGAN for theology, that was great. We were all ordained in those years. The ordination was Easter Sunday. So, I mean, you had a big lead up to it with the Easter ceremonies. And, you know, when the Easter ceremonies were done in the Latin, there was beautiful chants to them. Really beautiful music and solemnity. And of course, on the Easter night, you had the Exultet, which, and we had excellent guys at music and excellent singers. And when that was sung, you could feel the hair standing up in the back of your neck. And of course, then the next morning, instead of going to Mass, you went to Killamote Church, 2 or 3 kilometers away from KILTEGAN, which you walked to. And that's where you were ordained. And I'm sure it was lovely. It really was lovely. The whole family were there. You were only allowed your immediate family. Maximum 12 people. Maximum 12 people. That's what you were allowed. So the family just fitted into it. And sure it was. Then we had a little reception afterwards. And the singing, that's the thing, Joe. I'm not kind of harking back to the Latin, but some of the singing that was done in the Latin with Harry McCartney he had a degree in music. And music was very serious. It was practices and with an excellent choir, really excellent choir. So when they sung at the Mass, at the ordination, it became very, very moving. Like my brother even said, you know, he couldn't help it, the tears came to his eyes from the beauty of the music.
Hugo recalls his first appointment and how he left Ireland for Africa.
Well, just first of all, the appointment, we were told that the Superior General would meet us in the classroom.
Okay.
So we went into the classroom and the Superior General came in. Peter O'Reilly was his name. And he pulled out a slip of paper. I mean, it wasn't even a kind of an A4 paper. It was a torn piece of paper. And in it, he had the names and the appointments, and he just called them out. I was disappointed because, well, being Irish, we had a gambling thing on who would be going where. You know, people had a little bet on who was going where, and I was joint favourite for Brazil, myself and George Corr. So, of course, I thought I was going to Brazil. So then we were told we were going to Calabar. Now, if I'm to be honest, the old priests that we met coming home from Calabar, they seemed to be the strangest of our priests. They seemed to talk in kind of broken English half the time, and had very strange sayings, you know, or turns of phrase, and a bit grumpy. So I wasn't enamored of it, but then we didn't know anything about any of the places. Brazil was, because of the football and the world champions, you know, that had a special appeal. But I went to Nigeria and we went by boat. Myself and Tom Smith and Colin Clinton, Tony Cronin and Jim Birmingham. We all went in the same boat, two to a cabin. But it was a great journey out. It was a great journey, and the food was great. We never consistently ate so well as we did for the 3 weeks of the voyage. And yeah, we landed at Lagos and said goodbye to Tom Smith. Little did we know that poor Tom he was appointed to Minna. And his first experience was the massacres that were going on up in the north, in Kano, when he arrived there, and Minna saw a lot of killing going on. And then the boat continued round to Port Harcourt, and we were met. It took ages to get through customs, but we got through in the end. And one of the older priests, Father Fitzgerald, Tom Fitzgerald, was there to collect us. And I remember on the way back, because of the massacres in the north, because of the army coup, because of tension in the country, there were roadblocks all along. And when you were driving up to them, the soldiers would be there with their guns pointed at you and shouting at you. But then when they would see the priest, when they would see Father Tom in his white soutane, everything relaxed. And they just welcomed the Reverend Father. But it was tense times. And then I stayed the first night in Uyo, and all my money was stolen. Every penny I had that had been given before coming out, that was cleaned out. So that wasn't a very nice. And then there was a meeting. The first meeting I was at was the day after we arrived in Anoa. It was in Anoa Hospital in one of their big rooms. And the topic was whether the sisters should be sent home, because everybody was talking about war. Everybody was talking about the unease, that the country was going to fall apart. And it was just after the Congo, if you remember, the Congo, where a lot of missionaries were killed. So people didn't know. They were making plans, for example, that there should be a canoe down at Mwaniba to get us out if the whole place disintegrated into chaos. And the older priests were there saying, it's not going to happen. People won't touch you. You know, and nothing happened. But they were making plans just in case, because you didn't know what was going to happen. There was great uncertainty.
Hugo was right on the ground when the civil war broke out in Nigeria. I asked him what were the reasons for the war.
Well, it's complex, but as far as I can remember, the North had all the power. They talked about the power and the glory. The power was, Abubakar, whatever his name was, and the glory was Azikiwe, who was the president, but he'd no power. And there was a lot of corruption. So there was a military coup led by, was it Nzegu? Can't remember. And in the military coup, I think what was planned was that they would shoot the leaders in all the different regions. And they shot them in the north, and they shot them in the east, in the west, and in the Midwest. They didn't shoot them in the east. And in the north, the political leader, the Sardana of Sokoto, was also the religious leader as well as the political leader. So it was interpreted as two different things. One, that it was an Eastern coup, a predominantly Igbo coup to take over power. And the second one was that it was a strike against Islam. So there were those two elements in it. And that led to the dreadful, dreadful massacres that broke out in the north. I don't know whether that's been swept under the carpet or not, but my brother's sister-in-law was a sister of St. Louis. She talked about hiding the Easterners up in the attic, up beyond the ceiling, and feeding them at night. And I mean, the slaughter in Kano was dreadful. Like when Brendan Cooney arrived, my classmates, and Tom Smith arrived, they arrived around the same time as me. But what they went into immediately was bodies piled all around the place of people being slaughtered. And that went on for a week or so. You know, they even stopped the train with people trying to escape from the north. The train across the Niger, or one of the big rivers that you cross on the way down, and they stopped the train halfway over the bridge, and they slaughtered everybody on the bridge and threw them over. You know, when you come from Northern Ireland, you know that it's not an African thing. It can happen anywhere. We came very close to it in Northern Ireland, that kind of ethnic genocidal rage that happens. It happened in the Balkans. Of course, it happened in Germany in spades during the Second World War. But I don't know what happens. It's a kind of a madness takes over, a collective lust for blood and for killing and for revenge and for excitement, I suppose. And that's what led to secession. Now, Odumegwu Ojukwu and Gowan, they met where was it? In Ghana somewhere.
Ghana.
Aburi. On Aburi we stand became the big slogan. Now they agreed to a much stronger kind of federal independence for the country. You know, where each state would have much more autonomous than it is today. And they agreed to that. But we know that the day that Gowan came back, the British High Commissioner visited Dodden Barracks. And after that meeting, because Britain had huge investments in the oil, etc., in the East, and immediately after that, Gowan reneged on the agreement. And that's why people went round with this slogan on their chest, on a Bouri we stand. And when nothing was happening, I think it was 27th of May, if I can remember correctly. I can remember the speech. I was in visiting one of the sick priests in Anawa Hospital, and Odumego Ojukwu gave this speech declaring secession. And it was a very powerful speech. It was almost Churchillian in the way that it resonated. He had a tremendous command of the English language. And that was when the East seceded from the rest of the country. And for some of us, you couldn't blame them because they were being slaughtered everywhere. Not so much in Abuja, not so much in Lagos. I don't think there was anything in Lagos or in the Midwest, but in the northern states they were being slaughtered. So it was a call to hell with Nigeria, let's do it on our own. They don't want us. Well, we've got the wealth, we can do it ourselves. And that's when the secession started. May was when Biafra was declared.
All right.
The fighting didn't start for a while. Okay. And it must have been 18th of October. The 18th of October.
October, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And that was the St. Luke's Anawa Mission, St. Luke's Hospital. That was when we had our biggest do of the year. There would be a mass in the evening, and there would be a feed, a sing-song in the MMMs. And the bishop was there for it. He was walking up and down in the morning, and you could hear this boom, 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 boom. And I thought it was thunder at first. I was on the veranda. I could see the bishop. He'd stop and he'd listen. He'd cock his ear and he'd listen. He did that a few times. Then he closed his breviary and he walked straight down into the house. He said, "That thunder is too regular for thunder. There's something happening." And he turned on the radio. He's the only man I ever saw. He used to put the big old-fashioned radio on his big bony knees, and he'd use two hands twisting the knobs to try to get reception. And when he got reception, then we heard that Calabar was being invaded. And that's what happened, and that's what brought the war close to us. Though it took several months after Calabar was taken. And some of our priests in Calabar saw terrible things. In some ways, the war, I don't know, you can call it either it scarred me and did damage to me, or it wounded me in a way that made me more close to the people. Really close to the people. Because there was a wisdom and an understanding among the older people when you went to the outstations. And in those days, you went to the outstations and you slept there, and the older men and women would come in and they would chat and they would talk, and sometimes they'd bring a bottle of stout or something. Unfortunately, I didn't drink at that stage. I often regret that. I didn't drink until a good while after the war. But they had a patience with this young Irish guy, was kind of full to the gunnels with theology and philosophy. And yet the questions the people were asking had nothing to do with the answers that I had. But they had that patience and that wisdom and that kind of gentle guiding you and correcting you when you were going wrong, but in a way that didn't destroy your confidence or didn't bring you down. or didn't humiliate you. They had a way of correcting you in certain things. And yeah.
Okay. Hugo, can I ask you a question about, like, what if the Igbos had succeeded? Biafra had become independent. What type of country would you think Biafra would have been?
Would they ever have been left in peace to progress? That's one question. Not with European powers with vested interests. Though towards the end, France kind of came in a little bit on the side of Biafra. But I mean, it was the oil they were interested in, not the... Well, I don't want to be categorizing people. I wasn't politically shrewd at the time. I didn't pick up the old politics that were there before between the Igbo and the Ibibio and the Efik and the Agoja people and the Port Harcourt people. So for a while I glazed over that. I kind of saw us all. And to be honest, wires got crossed inside me between Northern Ireland and Biafra. There was a kind of a crossing over a little bit, or a mixing up at an unconscious level between. But in the end, the people in the East were more sinned against than sinning. The level of education in the East and the level of technical competence in the East was far in excess to what was there in other parts of the country. And that was due mainly to the fact that when the missionaries went to the north and even parts of Yoruba land, they had to fight and fight and fight to get some kind of property to educate people. Whereas in the East, the only fighting was between the villages trying to get the schools and, making great generous offers. You build a school, we will guarantee the children, we will guarantee this amount of money, we will guarantee the fees will be collected. So in the East, the only problem for the missionaries was where not to put a school, because they couldn't put schools everywhere. And as a result of that, and the fact that the girls were being educated at the same level as the boys, and as happens many places around the world, in many cases the girls were excelling more than the boys in schools. And I mean, just look at a little town like Uyo, which was a little backwater then. You had the Holy Child Sisters, who were very posh schools everywhere else in the world. Yet Holy Child Sisters were the very best of teachers there. You had the Daughters of Charity in Adiabong. You had the handmaids in Anoa. You had the MMM teaching hospital, where a girl that went through the hospital there, went through the studies, she didn't have to do any more exams. She could go to England, she could go to America. This was before the war. And she would immediately be granted employment, and her documents, her qualifications would be ratified by those countries. That was the way it was then. And so there was, development-wise, the East was far ahead of the North. And culturally, there was that impetus to progress, to get on in life, to make my life better than that of my father and grandfather. Whereas in the more Muslim-dominated, it was kind of cyclic, life goes on, everything's in the hand of Allah. And
Bishop James Moyna was the legendary KILTEGAN Bishop of Calabar. Father Hugo remembers him fondly.
He was a big Cavan man who followed the Cavan. His own club, Mullahorn, was where he was from. Same place as Tom Smith, a classmate of mine. And he followed the fortunes of his local football team. And on a Saturday, he'd be pulling around at the radio trying to get the results. You know, it's alleged, I don't know this for certain, it's alleged that he once wrote to the superior in our society, suggesting that the society shouldn't accept townies, as they were called. That's guys from towns. That they were far better with big, strong country boys. They were more suitable for working in Calabar. But he had this vision of development, that there would be a parish, there would be a priest in every village, there'd be a school, there'd be a clinic, there would be teacher training. He had this vision of education and healthcare and upliftment of the people. And he was very close to some. He was very close to your grandfather, Morris. Mm-hmm. But he was a good man. I think he was immensely saddened that he didn't get back. It broke him. And he was trying to walk a very tight rope, because he could see the political connotations of Biafra and the one Nigeria. And at heart he would have been for one Nigeria. But the existential reality was Biafra. So it was a hard thing to walk. And they published a map of the old Bight of Biafra, an old ancient map in which Biafra is used in the Catholic Life magazine, which was the highest circulation magazine, I think, in Nigeria at the time. And for that reason, the army came looking for him as soon as they came in. They came looking for Moyna, because I suppose in the minds of some of them, this was backing Biafra. This was but you know, at that time, there was great mixing between Igbo and the Ibibio and Efik people. You know, they all came to church. I wasn't aware, that's me as a young fella, I wasn't aware of the depths of hurt or prejudice or mistrust between them at the beginning. I learned it very soon afterwards, of course. But that was Bishop Moyna. But then when he went home, he retired as a parish priest in his own area. And again, he loved to play the bridge, loved to play bridge. It's an awful pity that he didn't write. You know, that he didn't sit down and kind of write, because any of this work, I think, it's like an experiment. It's like an experiment in living. And you know that science progresses because scientists kind of keep notes on what they're doing. And then that written record is able to show where they go wrong and where they go right. And you're able to progress from that, from one generation to the other.
An important feature in the life of the early missionaries in Nigeria was the transferring of their allegiance from a bishop who was European like them to a bishop who was Nigerian. For Hugo, it was from Bishop James Moyna to Bishop Brian Davis Usanga. Life with Usanga was not always pleasant, as Hugo recalls. Thankfully, it had a happy ending.
We had a strange relationship. Like in the end, he gave me such a hug that I'll never forget. And it was almost like two boxers at the end of a fight, the way they would embrace, or even there when you saw Rory McIlroy and Fleetwood last Sunday. And Fleetwood won in the last hole, and yet they were able to kind of put their arms around one another and embrace. It was the sisters that kept me sane. The old founder members of the Handmaids who lived on, 5 minutes walk from the cathedral. And when I went down and I tell them what he was saying, I used to tell this old one, Loisius, I can't remember her name, God, I can see her face. But I'd be telling her, Bishop seems to take great joy in torturing me. And she was saying, don't worry now, he's afraid. He's afraid, same as everybody else, because nobody knows what's going to happen. And that's the way he reacts. So don't mind him, don't mind him. And just go to the church and start praying a bit. And that's what really helped, because he'd give me the little barb and I'd rise to it and there'd be an argument. And I suppose I stopped taking the bait. So the little games maybe stopped a bit that time in Calabar. And then I know he respected me for what happened in MFAMOSING. But he wasn't going to bankroll me either to keep it running. But I know he respected me. And he told me that some of the parents in Calabar had said how much the boys liked me. So he did give you little bits of appreciation.
The Immaculate Conception Seminary in MFAMOSING, Calabar, is a big chapter in Father Hugo's missionary life. He tells us of his years in MFAMOSING.
Well, it was set up the year before by Sean Barry. Sean Barry was the first that was there. But then Sean Barry was taken by the society to be director of the spiritual year in KILTEGAN. And people thought that's the end of that, because the students from that first class were all transferred to Oran, where there was a minor seminary at the time. I didn't want to go, and I wasn't qualified to go. I had no degree, no nothing. But the one thing you couldn't doubt was the quality of the children coming there and their courage. And there's a word we use in Northern Ireland. They had spunk. They had spunk. They were real pioneers. They were coming into conditions that none of us nowadays could find acceptable. And they came in without complaint.
Thank you, Hugo.
Yeah, I remember getting advice from the principal in Holy Child School, Anne Colette Anwa, and she told me, feed the children and you'll have a happy school. Well-fed children are happy children. Happy children can learn. Hungry children are angry children, and angry children can't learn. That was the best advice. That was the only orientation course I had to go into teaching full-time or to go in as principal. But it worked. It worked. The potential of the Nigerian youth at that time was wonderful. And their eagerness to learn, they were the easiest children to teach in my life. And it was a pleasure they taught you what to teach them and how to teach them. And they'd ask questions. And one thing that I loved about MFAMOSING, that first class, they're still friends today. And they still look out for one another today. And whatever else education they may have got, surely that's a winner.
In a rather heartbreaking move, Father Hugo was asked by the bishop to transfer from MFAMOSING to Ikodene parish. Hugo found this very difficult to take. But it so happened that the National Missionary Seminary of St. Paul's, Nigeria, was about to be opened in Iperu, Ogun State. When Father Hugo was asked to begin its spiritual year, he accepted the offer wholeheartedly. He recalls his time in Iperu.
When I went there, there was nothing. I was told that's where the spiritual year is going to be. And there were 6 rooms, 3 facing 3, and nothing in them. Nothing in them. And the bush growing high up over the roof in the little pass between, and nothing happening. And the students were coming in 2 weeks. And then I got blown out of it by Father Sheeran. When I said that, well, I'd stay there, I was working out what would happen. He said, that's not how it's going to be done at all. That's not how it's going to be done at all. This is how it's going to be done. Now, he was the bursar. And that was always a problem for many years, that the guy with the money calls the shots. Then the next big challenge was to convince the guys that came that this, in fact, was the National Missionary Seminary. It wasn't an abandoned building in the middle of the bush. And yet they settled, with very little. And after an initial disappointment and begrudgery, after a couple of days of that, things went quite smoothly. And no complaints. No complaints. Iperu, I loved Iperu, yeah. And I loved the way it emerged from the bush. And everywhere I went with a pair of secateurs and plenty of newspaper, old newspaper in the back of the car. And I'd take cuttings from all over the country and I'd wrap them in the newspaper and soak it a bit and put it in the boot and then plant them when we got back.
Decades after working with the St. Paul's missionaries, Hugo is very proud of their work and how they have developed over the years.
But when my brother was dying, Colin was very close to me. The one priest he wanted to see was Father Victor from the cathedral in Sligo, who's a St. Paul's priest. The one priest he could talk to and could listen to. And Victor told me that when he was going around bringing communion to the sick, because Colin's wife was sick a lot of the time, he always went to Mcbride's last because he'd have good conversation and he'd have a good meal and he'd get something to eat, and it would be, he wouldn't have the pressure of moving on somewhere else. So I think that speaks volumes.
In the early 1990s, St. Patrick's Missionaries began a process of discerning internationalization of its membership. Father Hugo remembers that it was partly because Nigerians had started sending in applications to be members of the society, even without a formal invitation to do so.
Anyway, suddenly this started to come in, and it didn't stop. There was this trickle, and it grew to more coming in. And I remember I argued that it is insincere and less than honest to say that we are not accepting vocations until we have a house of formation built in Nigeria. And if we have no intention, or if there is no plan to build that house, then what we're doing is we're misleading these young men. We're not speaking the truth to it. And that was how the whole thing, to my mind, started to develop. But the society did hold a process of discernment, and it seemed to come out 50-50. And to be honest, I wasn't quite sure what the whole fuss was about, because the Superior General did not, in fact, need the permission of the society to admit anyone into the society. All he needed was the permission of his council, of the a majority vote in his council. That's all that was required. So it was more for political reasons and for keeping the society together in unity and not causing a rift that they went through that whole process. And my own gut feeling was that when all the shouting and hullabaloo is over, we are going to internationalize sooner or later. And I remember the community in Iperu wrote, well, they asked me to write in their name a statement that from our experience in Iperu and Gwagwalada, and from the reality of the applications coming into the house in Lagos, it seems to be the Lord that is calling us to this. And
so Hugo, tell me, I mean, what fears did you have around maybe the quality of missionaries that would come out from the going international? Did you ever feel, look, you know, these new guys coming are not going to be like us? Or should I dare say, they are not going to be as good or as generous as us? Did that ever come into your mind at that time, Hugo?
To be deadly honest, no, not with the experience of Iperu. What did come into my mind was the need for careful selection and discernment of candidates coming into the program. Maybe there was a little bit of the supremacy thing, that we would do it better than others were doing it. We would do that selection better. Well, history again shows that we weren't that accurate. But as I've said to you many times, Joe, that is where, like the documents in formation emphasize nearly every time that the primary cause of difficulty in formation is a wrong decision regarding the maturity of the candidate at the point of entry. And let me put it this way too. Trying to make a judgment on the behavior of a student is a very tricky business, because you can have compliance, or you can have what Rula calls non-internalizing identification going on, which means that the guy will conform to any role, any expectation, any mode of behavior that he reckons is necessary in order to achieve what he wants, without anything really happening, without any interiorization going on. But I had seen enough, God Almighty, he had wonderful young men in Peru. We just weren't very good at. They were all good people, let me put it this way. They were all good people, but some obviously weren't cut out for the job. You know, the emotional impulse of their life was leading them in other directions. But they got through, and then they caused a lot of havoc since, and then.
Father Hugo was appointed to be the first director of the philosophy phase of the new International Formation Program of St. Patrick's Society, which kicked off in the year 1999. The first class started first in Esigodini in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa, before moving to KwaPatrick, which is near the seminary college called St. Joseph's, Sedara.
So there was a reluctance maybe to get back into formation again. I'd given enough, I thought. But then when I was told to do it, when I was appointed to do it, my way of thinking, that's it, I do it. And my first impression when you guys arrived, it's a bit hard talking to you now, you're one of them. But when you guys arrived, the feeling that I had was, God, they're a lovely bunch of young fellas. They were bright, intellectually very sharp. They were mature. Their personalities had developed. And like I was confident, you know, they seemed to be a happy bunch too, and that helps. Seemed to be a happy group, and they seemed to get on very well together. That was the first initial appraisal. That was my first insight, and as you know from Lonergan, insights are a dime a dozen, but they don't necessarily have to be that accurate. But by and large, my initial appraisal was accurate. Like intellectually, they were very sharp. They were a happy bunch. But like in every group, you had the strong and you had the weak. You had the outstanding personalities and you had the less outstanding personalities. You had the generous and you had the bit selfish. You had the willing, you had the reluctant. You had that mixture in the group, if you wanted to classify guys. But then in every individual, like every other individual, you had your strengths and you had your weaknesses. And individually, for the most part, guys were good to work with. But as a group, whatever the hell happened to you, it could be quite difficult at times as time went on. As time went on. Well, I don't know, maybe I was a bit hard. I don't know. Maybe I had stresses from other things. I've never, ever been regarded as one of the most patient people in life that you'll meet. So I don't know. Maybe the situation in Essegodini got to them. Maybe I was too hard on them. I don't know. Maybe it was because they were confident enough and mature enough to be up front and let it all out, and that you were really dealing with your equals, and you could have a man-to-man fight. But there was as a group, there was a certain reluctance to take correction or to take advice. There was a kind of a rebelliousness going on. And I don't know, that's the way it was. Maybe that's the answer, that's the way it was, that's the way it is. That's probably the way it's going to be when you're dealing with students or other people. Life is different now.
After a number of years in Kwapatrick, Father Hugo took a short break before taking up an appointment in OAKFORD, still in Durban Diocese of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa.
And then I went back and I went to OAKFORD. Again, and this has been my experience throughout, like when I went to OAKFORD, God, my heart fell. It turned on the water and it was brown. And you had mosquitoes that were twice or three times the size of the mosquitoes in Nigeria and more numerous. And you had, when I went in, driving in the gate, the bishop was driving out. Bishop, he wasn't bishop, he was bishop, yeah. Barry Wood. He said, you can't live in that house. He said, it's not fit for human habitation. But the sister said, they'll put you up in the guest room. I thought, God, the guest room is going to be lovely. Guest room was the state of the art for the 1940s, and the furniture hadn't changed. When you got into the bed, you sank right down in the middle. There was a big hole in the bed. You couldn't even. And I listened to the third movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony every night to calm me and that's what got me through, because I knew, like old Muhammad Ali and rope-a-dope, they play rope-a-dope for a couple of weeks and everything's going to be fine after that. But I got to know the youth there very well, very well, maybe too well in parts, you know, because it was an open house, but we were only half an hour from the ocean, so we'd pack up about 15 of them in the backy and off to the ocean. And, you know, a couple of rand got you enough for a picnic. Actually, we'd a ball of a time. I mean, the people were lovely, no doubt about it. They were lovely. So I went back there. I was there for 5 years. That's when I started writing, because I was watching. I mean, one night I said, what the name of God am I sitting listening to what the weather forecast for Saudi Arabia is? What the fuck am I doing? Because you couldn't go out at night. You couldn't go out. And that's when I started writing, just to try to wean me off dependence on the escapism of the television. And that's how those books came. They weren't intended as books. It was just intended as a therapy to get me out of it. Sure, I liked it. I was also doing a bit of retreat work at the time.
After OAKFORD, Father Hugo moved to the parish in KWADUKUZA in Stanger, where he is enjoying what you might call a semi-retirement. It is there we conducted this interview in the year 2024. I asked him what he hopes for in the future.
I'd like to reach 2025 for a start.
Okay.
Sometimes I get a little health scare, and there's something inbred in me that tries to avoid doctors as much as I can, but I know I need to go to see one now. But I hope to survive a little. I hope to stay here. I love this country. It breaks my heart to see the poverty. It breaks my heart to see the rich tooling around in their Lamborghinis. what do you call those red cars? The big expensive cars that cost millions. You see them here all along the coast, and then just a couple of kilometres away inland, you see families living in dire poverty and living off their granny's pension. And that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that the kids who studied hard and got to university and got through university and they can't get a job, and the helplessness of it, and the fact that you're sitting on what could possibly be a time bomb that the country could blow at any time. And I wouldn't blame it if it did blow, because I can't see the rich sharing. They're too goddamn selfish. And so I don't know, even the way that the wildlife is dying and the ocean is being polluted.
We sincerely thank Father Hugo Mcbride for granting us this interview on SPMS Media. I thank him personally for influencing my life since I met him back in 1999 and for looking after my grandfather in the 1960s. We wish him the very best for the future. Joe.Archibong for SPMS Media.